Yes, good morning and welcome. You're watching Power Breakfast right here on Citizen TV. My name is Freddie Ndimuli. It's that time when we take a look at the headlines. This morning we're very privileged to have four distinguished gentlemen, members of Parliament. Let's start with Senator Moses Kajwang from Homa Bay County. We do have Senator Kimani Wamatangi from Kiambu County, Titus Hamala MP Lurambi, and Isaac Mora, nominated senator. Good morning, gentlemen, and karibuni sana.
Good morning. Thank you.
Just before we get down to looking at the headlines, of course, I do realize that I've hosted quite a number of you, at least 3 of you, but Senator Kimani Wamatangi, this is your first time since a re-election as senator. You've been on this panel before. You're a very familiar face on the panel. I'd like to give you an opportunity to thank the good people of Kiambu for giving you that opportunity.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Fred. And I remember the last time we were here, that was during the heat of nominations. And I thank God that we went through the exercise. I want to thank the people of Kiambu for having given me the opportunity to serve them a second time as their senator. And also the people of Kenya for giving themselves also good leadership generally in the National Assembly and in the Senate. And I believe also in the upcoming elections of the 17th of October, we'll also be able to give ourselves one more time the leadership that we desire and deserve as we had done before of His Excellency the President. So thank you, Fred. This has been a very enlightening platform to the people of Kenya. Even the few days when I've not been here since the election, I get comments every day that we are missing you in action.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Because definitely everyone is watching. Kenya is watching. This is indeed the biggest Power Breakfast. This is indeed the only Power Breakfast this side of the continent. And let's now take a look at the headlines. Very interesting headlines this morning. Even before we get down to the political headlines, and that is what is flashing. Tricky days ahead as Uhuru Raila dig in. Opposition chief says NASA is not boycotting repeat elections, but will also not allow Jubilee to go it alone come October 17th. That's the biggest headline on the Daily Nation. On the Standard, Uhuru, why I was angry and pained. I'm only human. President admits he was maddened by annulment of his victory, calls ruling unwarranted, but insists his anger was directed at the court and Maraga, not CJ's Kisii community. Vows he will be re-elected. But something that catches my eye, and probably this is something that should be of major concern to many Kenyans, is what features on the top strips of both the dailies. Yes, if we could start off with the Daily Nation. It is time to remove cap on interest rates, says Central Bank Governor Patrick Njoroge roots for freely imposed charges. That story is on page 36 of the Daily Nation. It also features on the front page of the Standard, also on the top strip. Interest rates, CBK governor hints at possibility of stopping capping. That story is on page 40 of the Standard. Let's start off with that, gentlemen. On page 36, that's a business section of the dailies. And the central bank said yesterday the cap on interest rates was likely to be lifted in the near future, citing preliminary data from a joint study with the Treasury on its impact on growth of credit. Now, the governor for the central bank, Patrick Njoroge, said even if this was to pass, commercial banks will have to be more disciplined in pricing loans so that they do not overcharge borrowers. Now, to very many Kenyans, this is not the kind of headline that we'd like to be seeing. That interest rate caps, I'm sure, of course, the banks have their own reasoning, the central bank as well. The players in that particular sector have their own reasoning as to why they would want a more liberalized market in as far as setting up of interest rates. But this was one of the things that we celebrated in the first term of President Uhuru Kenyatta's presidency, the cap on interest rates. Now we're seeing, even now as we're still determining who will be the next president, that this could actually be reversed. Let's start off with you, Senator Moses Kajwang. How does this make you feel? Is this the way we should be going? Do you think that Parliament will actually reverse this cap on interest rates?
Thank you, Fred. The issue of interest rates can only be affected by Parliament. Remember, it was Mheshimiwa Jude Njomo who came up with the amendment, which was passed overwhelmingly in Parliament and assented to by the President. We do hope that our brothers on the Jubilee side are not going to misuse their tyranny of numbers to impose something that will hurt common mwananchi. A lot of Kenyans, and even me in particular, have gone to banks to secure loans. Prior to the amendments to the law, interest rates could be as wild as 20, 30, 40%. At least now we are seeing some discipline. In fact, I tell you, Fred, in the 12th Parliament, some of us will be seeking to explore ways of bringing microfinance institutions under a controlled interest rate regime. Because some of these microfinance institutions, those that Kenyans call Shylocks, can charge as much as 200% per annum. And they are really hurting that mama mboga who sometimes needs cash for a day or for 2 days, and then they refund it at the end of 2 days when they've done their trade. So I can commit to you that as a NASA coalition, we support a controlled interest rate regime. The central bank governor can only inform Parliament. And I'd really like to see the kind of studies that they've conducted in the last 1 year. In my view, 1 year is not sufficient period for us to conduct or to collect empirical data to make us change our minds on that particular piece of legislation.
Yes.
We will still support a controlled interest rate regime, and this is something we also need to hear from the Jubilee side, and particularly President Kenyatta, because he's a banker and it is on public record that he owns a bank. I hope that we are not making decisions based on motivation for personal profit.
Yes, and we do have Jubilee members on the panel this morning. Senator Kimani Wamatangi. Of course, there's that question about access to credit.
Yes.
The cap on interest rates actually made the situation worse. Now banks are no longer lending as much as they used to, simply because of the risk is much higher vis-a-vis the returns. But surely this was one of those things that we really applauded. Generally as Kenyans, even parliamentarians, you were part of that parliament that actually passed this law. Don't you think that reversing that could be detrimental and could probably even affect President Uhuru Kenyatta's legacy?
Maybe two things to say. First, I want to acknowledge that from the general thinking of those that call themselves professionals in that field, or not really those who call themselves, but those who are specialists in that field, bankers, economists, statisticians, if you ask them their point of view, largely not only here but globally, they front for a position whereby the regime of either interest rates or banking should be left to the forces of the economy. That's usually the argument, that if you let it in a free economy to control themselves and be controlled by other aspects and factors, then that is the way you can let an economy thrive on its own. That could be so ideally from the perspectives of what should be done or what would happen if the players were disciplined. And I think we need to remember that for many years running, Kenyan banks have been the most profitable institutions, say for a few companies like probably Safaricom and a few others, Kenya Breweries and so on, but banks have been making huge profits which in my own wording here before I have termed as immoral profits. I mean, you find a bank reporting a profit of 17 billion, 10 billion per annum, and remember the bankers there, and has been documented, majority of the bankers are small scale traders, those in the small and micro enterprise, part of our economy. And so I think what we need to say as members of Parliament, and especially I believe also from the Jubilee side, what I would want to see happening is improvement of the existing legislation that brought about the capping, because within that capping, it does not say that when you are charging this much, there is interference between zero and the cap. I mean, they can play in between there as long as, and if there are other aspects that need to be improved, would be improved, but there has to be some sort of control that says that Kenyans cannot continue to be exploited the way they are. And remember, the banks had the opportunity to take advantage to demonstrate their goodwill before, because Fred, remember that we had the Doden bill. You remember? Yes. When the member of parliament from that part of our country, and there was a lot of debate. Unfortunately, his bill never saw light of day then, and that should have been the warning shot to banks that you need to organize your market space. and make sure that what you're doing is not only beneficial to yourselves but to the common one entity who is your customer. And I think that is where they lost it. We cannot trust banks anymore right now and say that we leave it to them, that
so
now they're going to control
support,
themselves and do the right thing.
Would you support a reversal of this cap?
Absolutely not.
No.
I would not support a reversal of the cap. I would support an improvement of that particular legislation, that law. The banks can make their own contribution. They may say, this is what is hurting us and this is the way to improve it. But calling for a reversal or a removal of it would not be necessarily in the interest of the common man. It may be in the interest of banks and bankers. But I mean, this economy is 60–70% made of the small scale traders and the people who live below that margin that banks would want to see and call their core customers.
And Senator, you said, and rightly so, that the issue has been disciplined by banks, indiscipline rather, that this new regime, the cap on interest rate, was brought about or was necessitated by the fact that banks were totally indisciplined. They could charge, and according to the description by the central bank governor here, they were making supernormal profits. Profits that could not be explained in any other market, yet in Kenya they were making interest rates as high as 38% per annum. Let me come to Bwana Titus Hamala in Lurambi. You are one of those people who will now be called upon because this, whatever proposal comes from the central bank, and this is the central bank governor speaking, will still have to come back to Parliament for legislation. You are one of those people who will be called upon to actually debate and legislate on this. What will your input be?
Fred, thank you. I think all of us would agree that many people in this country and global, worldwide, many people have been enslaved by banks. People have walked in to take loans, and we realize we have micro borrowers and macro borrowers. Today you want to invest, you want to do anything, home improvement, you want to venture into a business, real estate, you have to go to the bank and get money. But these loans on repayment is just like never ending. Take for a little example of users of MasterCards and Visa cards, you know, those who are using credit cards. And this thing just never comes to an end. And I think if we allow freelance in this market, freelance, where banks can fix their own, then we are in trouble. And that is why I support the senators here, that as members of Parliament and members of the Senate, there comes a time when we have to unite for a common cause for Kenyans. Whether, like me, I'm from the NASA coalition, and the senators here are from the Jubilee, and Kajwang and myself, we are from the NASA coalition. When it comes to being there for the Kenyans, that's when we unite. We come, we strike a bipartisan position so that we protect Kenyans from exploitation, because banks can really exploit. And so to me, I say this is not the right direction. This is wrong. It's going to take us back, because we've made gains already. There's been legislation and we've made gains. And now when we go into that freelance mode, unbelievable. These banks are terrible. I mean, we need money from them, but they're terrible.
Senator Isaac Mwaura, and there are those who say that when this piece of legislation was passed and signed by President Uhuru Kenyatta, perhaps it was one of those pieces of legislation that probably had the potential to win President Uhuru Kenyatta re-election. That this was major enough. Actually, across the country, there was applause. This was one of the things that could actually form President Uhuru Kenyatta's legacy, that he oversaw the capping of interest rates. Do you think the president and the numbers he has in Parliament can be used to reverse this?
Yeah, thank you very much, Fred. First, I think also I take this opportunity to congratulate my fellow Kiambu resident, Senator Kimani Wamatangi. We voted for him overwhelmingly.
Oh, incidentally, now we have two senators from Kiambu.
But he is the senator for Kiambu.
Yes.
I'm the senator for persons with disabilities.
From Kiambu.
No, senator for persons with disabilities.
From Kiambu. From Kiambu.
Yeah, okay. Now, honestly, Fred, we cannot have a situation where we reverse what is a major gain for this country. I remember Jude Jomo invited us at Duberi Stadium there to celebrate, and we were with Jude Donde to celebrate this great achievement of our country. And for me, I read mischief when the central bank governor is relying on data, of course, manufactured by the same banks. And we were not expecting them to provide evidence that now more and more Kenyans were taking credit. The truth of the matter is the banks were preferring to sell their credit more to treasury bills and offshore investments, and they were actually, giving us this credit at a premium. And you expect a lull. I mean, you expect that they provide evidence suggesting that the economy is not growing, and that's not true, because essentially what they've done, they have been creating some tariff barriers around the stringent measures as to access the very credit at 14%. And so really we need to have a longer term kind of study, and I do not foresee, even if it were to be an official policy, that the Senate and the National Assembly would agree to resign on this great gain. And the president himself, being a banker, in fact his first job was a bank teller actually, he would not agree to such a thing. I think this is the position of Jubilee. So central bank governor, I think you need to do more studies. We need to have to see how many Kenyans have accessed credit and what that has been done. I would want to disagree that people are defaulting just because interest rates have come down. That cannot happen. What the banks need to do is to know that we have a liberal economy. There needs to be more players. I think we have seen consolidation of banks which are not performing. Because if you also don't do that, then you are actually releasing our people to shylocking. You are making them to be out there to be exploited just because you are not giving money when you actually have it. And I think, Fred, let's give time. I mean, the banks will not just hold money. They are collecting from you, from me, from everybody here, and they can't just keep this kind of cash. I mean, let us not just make decisions because we have preliminary data that is largely supposed to ensure that we sabotage that very green. And I think the Jubilee administration would want to see increased investment. That is why, the administration has invested a lot in infrastructure.
And gentlemen, you must agree, you are in the National Assembly. These banks are very influential. For them to actually get to a point where even the central bank governor is now agreeing with the banks, it just goes to show how influential the banks and the players within the banking industry are. That influence could also determine how Parliament approaches or handles this piece of legislation. Senator Moses Kajwang, are you confident that the crop of legislators we have this time around can actually withstand the kind of influence that could come from the banking sector? Because yes, lobbying is real. You've been in Parliament and lobbying for special interest groups is real. Do you think the current crop of legislators can withstand that kind of pressure?
I'm quite confident because we rely on the people to support us and to consolidate our positions in power. And if I went back to Homa Bay and told the Mamambogas who rely on these short-term loans that I'm going to create a scenario where their loans are going to be more expensive, they're going to have serious issues with me. And so for parliamentarians, it is it starts at that personal level for their own survival. It is untenable, it is politically unhygienic for us to be even seen to be considering an increase or a changing of the interest rate regime. And as I mentioned, a lot of pressure is on us also to control the Shylocks, to control the microfinance institutions, to control the mobile-based lending companies, because whatever they charge is extremely out of this world. And that is where most of the people at the base of the pyramid come from. As to the moral steel of the current parliament, we are waiting to see. Fred, you have seen scenarios where our brothers and sisters from Jubilee sometimes are hardened to State House and they are given directives. You saw that happen when they were dealing with the issue of House leadership, and the president called them and told them, your whip shall be so and so. My brother Kimani Wamatangi, a gentleman I've served with in the 11th parliament, a man of distinction, had expressed interest to be the deputy speaker of the Senate, to Today we will be electing a deputy speaker of the Senate. How I wish Kimani Wamatangi would have been allowed to contest for that position, because I would have given him my vote of all the people out of the Jubilee side. So you see a situation where some of our colleagues are herded into State House and they are given directives. I do pray that on this issue of interest rates, the President is not going to call them to State House and tell them that this is what must happen. There's also another issue of concern, my final point on this. There is something we call legislation by presidential memoranda. We saw this in the 11th Parliament. A situation where Parliament and both houses spend days and weeks and months and even years to come up with pieces of legislation. Once it has been passed in both houses of Parliament and sent to the President for assent, the President writes a memorandum back to Parliament. And remember, overturning a presidential memorandum requires 2/3 of the House. So sometimes the executive waits for Parliament or the legislature to come up with laws. Then when it goes for assent, the executive now wants to amend or influence that legislation, knowing that they are shielded by the Constitution, knowing that getting 2/3 to overturn that memorandum is difficult. And they go to the extent of even writing how the law should be. You know, a presidential memorandum should basically raise points of principle.
Yes.
Why the President thinks that a law should not be implemented the way Parliament has passed
And
it.
leave the legislation.
And leave the legislation. But we have seen memoranda being so specific up to clauses and articles and recommending the wording. So I hope that the President will not call people to State House. I hope that the President will not wait for us to pass legislation and then reverse it through a presidential memorandum.
Senator Wamatangi, I know you want to respond to Senator Moses Kajwang, and as you do that, I'll ask you the same question, even with regard to what he has just said, that yes, the banks may not necessarily need Parliament or parliamentarians to actually change their minds on this. They just need to convince one person, and this is President Uhuru Kenyatta. Yes. Now, when this is the same question I asked Senator Isaac Mwaura, that when President Uhuru Kenyatta signed that piece of legislation last year, he was keen on his re-election. This legislation could come, and this is hypothetical, could come in his second term if he gets re-elected. Could come in his second term when he does not need to get re-elected again. He's just serving his last term, so he's not really keen on re-election. Do you think that the President could actually change his mind on this, the capping of interest rates?
Well, thank you, Fred. Let me first say that it is not a lie. It's not preposterous to say that the issue or the question of capping of interest rates is a matter of high national importance. It attracts a lot of attention from Kenyans and interest from Kenyans. And so definitely the people who are affected by that decision are the larger majority by far. I would highly doubt and confirm that absolutely the President has made other decisions on behalf of this country, on behalf of many Kenyans, not because he was going to be re-elected or was seeking to be re-elected, but because it is right to do so. And let me say, because my brother Kajwang has brought that angle first on the issue of veto of legislation, or in our case with our constitutional provisions, the President having a say in how legislation finally is ascertained to or amended when it gets to him. And remember, Fred, in this government, according to our constitution, our government comprises of all three arms of government. That's the judiciary, executive and legislature. And in the course of making law, each of those arms of government has an opportunity to have a say in how legislature or legislation is made. Because if for example a law is made that is not consistent with our democratic interest, one can go to court and have that law overturned. When Parliament suggests and proposes a law and makes it, it is also a requirement, not only in our country, but probably in all democracies, that also the executive has a say in it. And the way the President does that is to have either send the law back with proposals, and that's the idea. You see, if the President was proposing that amend this, but the Constitution, yes, requires that Parliament raises 2/3 majority to effect or to negate that amendment, it is upon Parliament. If the matter is of such national importance to be passed as a law or not to be amended, then members of Parliament, because they are there, they're elected, they'll come to the table. So on those two issues, I don't think that really there is any either ill intention.
So your message to Kenyans is that we should not really get worried about this headline?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. And I take Senator Kajwang's offer and message of goodwill that you have voted for me.
That's one vote that you already have.
If I was going to be running for Deputy Speaker, I want to confirm to my brother Senator Kajwang, you can keep your vote somewhere for me. You may be voting for me in a bigger position. Very near, in the very near future.
Yes, indeed. As the Senator rightly said,
I just wanted to say, I wanted to say to my brother there that members of the Jubilee coalition are not herded anywhere and given directions. But we must appreciate that within our laws also, and within the recognition of the operation of democracy, that parties have their own structure, and that is why we have a political parties bill. And in a parliamentary group meeting, which is perfectly legal, decisions of how the party should be run are made. And by the way, I gladly, after consultations with my party leadership, agreed that for purposes of mapping our strategy, it is in the best interest that I let Senator Kithure Kindiki ran for the position of Deputy Speaker while I prepare my arsenal to serve the party in a better position and gun for a bigger position. So that's why I said, keep that vote. I'll be needing it for bigger things, Senator Kajwang, which will even probably help your people.
Yes, the politics within Senate, the politics within the House of Senate playing out here on Power Breakfast this morning. We do have 3 senators in the House and 1 member of the National Assembly. And it's time now for us to take a break. When we return, we'll be talking about the politics. But with regard to laws and how legislators work on this, there's one very interesting headline on page 8 of the Standard, and it reads that Jubilee legislators plan to amend law to rein in judiciary. Jubilee is planning new legislation to reduce the powers of the courts and make it difficult to invalidate the election of the president. We'll be discussing that after the break.